Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the past literally. You're stepping over the wooden threshold of a medieval home, where the floor is dirt, the walls are timber, and the air smells faintly of old stew and sheep. You look around and realize this is where people slept. Not in comfort, not in safety, and not for long. The flickering candle throws shadows across the walls. The bed looks more like a collapsed hay bale than a real mattress, and there's a draft that might be trying to kill you. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You approach the bed, not quite what you imagined. Medieval beds, especially for peasants, weren't really beds. They were piles of straw shoved into a sack, or woven frame, maybe with a thin sheet on top, if you were fancy. No springs, no memory foam. Just hope, and hay, and the hay isn't fresh. It's dusty, sharp, and absolutely crawling with life. Mites, fleas, maybe something with a few too many legs. You shift your weight, and the mattress makes a crunching noise. That's probably not comforting. If you're rich, maybe you get a wooden frame raised off the floor so the rats don't nibble your toes, and if you're really rich, you get curtains, not for privacy, but to trap body heat in the freezing air. You lie back, and the headboard creaks like it's going to betray you. Welcome to sleep in the 14th century. Candles burn near midnight, because it's romantic, but because your house doesn't have windows. Not real ones anyway. Just wooden shutters that don't close right. So the candle is your only light source. It flickers, it sputters, it could fall over at any moment. You'd think it would help people wind down. Instead, it's a literal fire hazard. More than one medieval town burned to the ground thanks to a single forgotten taper. Sweet dreams, right? Some people slept with their entire families in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, sometimes with chickens, goats, or a pig curled nearby, because warmth is warmth and livestock didn't complain. But sleep wasn't deep. You had to stay semi-alert. Creaks in the night could be the wind door, someone trying to steal your food, your tools, or your life. It wasn't paranoia. It was just smart. There's also the ceiling. Thatched roofs, those picturesque bundles of straw stacked high above look charming on postcards. But in reality, they're flammable. They shed dust and bugs, and sometimes animals crawl into them. You lie beneath it hoping that no startled weasel decides to fall through the rafters onto your chest, and forget insulation heat rises, and your fire is downstairs. So up here, it's cold. Very cold. And you're wearing all your clothes because you need every layer to survive the night. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept better than we do. Today's claim less stress, no blue light, more natural cycles. But honestly, that straw poking your back disagrees, and so does the firelight stinging your eyes. One odd trick medieval folks used to make things cozier was placing hot stones or metal pots, filled with embers at the foot of the bed. A makeshift heater, if you will. But if you knocked it over, congratulations, you just set your bed on fire. Again, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a nightly negotiation between warmth, pests, and combustion. In richer homes, things were marginally better. You might have a feather mattress if you were truly elite. But those feathers, they weren't hypoallergenic, and they tended to absorb all the sweat, oil, and unfortunate fluids people left behind. You didn't change your sheets regularly. Textiles were expensive. A fresh wash once a season was considered diligent. So everything reeked faintly of damp wool and ancient body odor, and pillows. Well, they existed, but not everyone had them. Some people used bundled rags. Others just used their own arms. Sleeping like a log was more literal. Some folks would literally tuck logs or wood blocks beneath their heads. Orthopedic. Not quite. Then there were the bugs. Oh yes. Bedbugs weren't just a modern horror. They'd been around for thousands of years. People sometimes burned herbs or hung bundles of pungent flowers to drive them off. Did it work? Not really. But it smelled marginally better than your uncle's feet. And on the off chance you had lice, you might be encouraged to shave your head and wear a linen coif to bed. Medieval fashion meets pest control. And if you got up in the night, no bathroom. You had a chamber pot, basically, a portable toilet bowl. You'd stumble over to it, try not to trip over your cousin, and do your business as quietly as possible. The next morning, someone would empty it, or forget. Many a medieval morning began with the pleasant aroma of what didn't quite make it outside. Still, you settle in. You close your eyes. You hear the wind rattle the shutters. A dog barks in the distance. Something scurries near the hearth. You're not sure if it's a rat or a neighbor. Either way, you pull your cloak tighter and hope that tonight's sleep isn't interrupted by fire, theft, fleas, or worse. You open your eyes. Not because it's morning, but because, well, this is how it works. In the Middle Ages, people didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do now. Instead, your night was divided quite literally into two parts. First, sleep and second sleep. And waking up in the middle wasn't a sleep disorder. It was the plan. The first sleep usually began not long after the sun went down, depending on the season. So around 8 or 9 p.m., you're curling up in your scratchy wool tunic, burrowing into your itchy straw bed, and slipping into the first chunk of sleep. This might last about 4 hours. Then, like clockwork, you'd wake up, and not just groggily, shuffle around the room. People would actually do stuff in the middle of the night. Some would pray, some would meditate. Some might, if the vibe was right, sneak in a bit of intimate time with their spouse. Historians have noted that this gap was considered an ideal time for, shall we say, making more medieval people. Others would tend to livestock, read religious texts, if literate, mend clothing, or even visit neighbors. Yes, the kind of behavior that would get you labeled insomniac. Today was totally normal back then. And it wasn't just commoners. Even clergy, who lived on rigid schedules, planned their sleep in these segments. Monks in monasteries would rise for night prayers called vigils, or matins, before going back to sleep until sunrise. Rich or poor, first and second sleep were a cultural norm. Why? Well, some researchers think it's because of the lack of artificial light. When it's pitch black by 6 p.m., your body naturally winds down earlier. And since a full winter night might stretch 12 to 14 hours, your body just split the difference. It needed a break. Historians still argue whether this pattern was driven more by biology or by culture. Did people truly need the split sleep, or did their routines simply evolve to match the rhythms of a candlelit world? We're not totally sure, but records from across Europe suggest it was widespread. Everyone, from farmers to friars, expected to wake in the night and ease back down later. You sit there in the half-dark. The fire has burned low. The shadows on the walls are softer now, gentler. There's a quiet kind of peace in this interval. People whispered during this time, not just because others were sleeping, but because it felt sacred, like the world was holding its breath. This midnight window also became the perfect time for storytelling. Parents would quietly pass along folk tales to wide-eyed children who couldn't fall back asleep. Grandparents muttered about omens and dreams, and sometimes dreams were the story. Medieval people gave serious weight to dreams. They were seen as messages, warnings, or even visitations. Waking up in the middle of the night gave them time to ponder, to interpret, to worry, because sometimes your dream wasn't just a dream. It might be a sign that something very real was coming for you. And while all this sounds strangely wholesome, it wasn't always relaxing. The middle of a night break could also mean waking up cold, hungry, or sick. Your fire might have gone out. You might hear suspicious noises outside. And if you were poor and lived in a communal house, this was also prime time for someone to relieve you of your shoes, your food, or your coin pouch, while you were distracted, rubbing your eyes. Or if you're lucky enough to own a clock, well, a sundial, maybe a rooster, you might simply realize it's not time to worry yet. Back to bed for the second round. Eventually, your body starts to feel the pull again. The middle hour fades. You lie back down and let second sleep carry you toward morning. But this stretch of sleep might be lighter, dreamier, more fragmented. After all, you've already had your deepest rest. And this sleep pattern wasn't seen as strange, was written about in everything from doctors' manuals to prayer books. Doctors even prescribed activities for the waking gap. Some suggested this was the best time to let out bad humors through cupping, bleeding, or just thoughtful sighing. Others said it was the hour when your thoughts were clearest, and your soul most in tune with the divine. Today, if you wake up in the middle of the night, you might grab your phone, stare at the ceiling, or silently panic about being awake. But in the Middle Ages, you would have simply accepted it. Maybe whispered a prayer, maybe tossed another log on the fire, or maybe wandered outside to look at the stars. It wasn't cloudy or raining, or haunted. Because this moment, this still, strange hour wasn't an interruption. It was just part of the night. People didn't even have a word for insomnia the way we do now. It was normal to wake, normal to wait, normal to sleep again. And honestly, there's something comforting about that. A night broken not by stress or digital noise, but by a shared cultural rhythm. You weren't alone. Across the fields, in stone cottages and damp cellars, hundreds of others were waking too. Stretching, murmuring, preparing to slip quietly back into dreams. Just don't forget to stir the fire, check the shutters, and tuck your chamber pot somewhere safe before you settle in again. You wake up in the middle of second sleep again. Not because it's morning yet, but because something in the bed just moved, or bit you, or poked you in the lower back. Welcome to the deeply unpleasant world of medieval Sleeping was basically just a polite negotiation with a pile of hazards wrapped in linen. Let's start with the stuffing. Most common folk didn't have down feathers, or even soft wool fillings. No, they had straw, lots of it. Called a pallet, or sometimes a straw bed. It was literally just a big cloth sack, stuffed with last season's hay. And not the fluffy cartoon hay. This was the kind that splintered, poked, and crackled every time you turned over. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Like sleeping on a salad, if you were lucky. The straw might be replaced once a season wise, if you were rich in both coins and ambition. But mostly it just got squashed flat, full of old sweat, food crumbs, and the assorted remnants of human life. Which brings us to the bugs. The mattress was like a cozy hotel for parasites. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs weren't occasional visitors. They were long-term tenants. You might go to bed cleanish, but you were guaranteed to wake up itching. That's why some folks hung pungent herbs like wormwood, lavender, or tansy around their beds. Not because they were into medieval aromatherapy, but because those plants were said to drive away pests. Did it work? Meh. Historians still argue whether these natural repellents were truly effective, or just wishful thinking, disguised as interior decorating. And if bugs weren't enough, there were also rodents. Not on the bed usually, but around it. Floor-sleeping peasants were especially vulnerable to late-night whiskered visitors, but even raised beds weren't completely safe. Rats and mice found all that dropped food and warmth incredibly attractive. People sometimes set traps, or got a house-catan early form of furry home security. But if your cat wasn't particularly motivated, you might find yourself playing footsie with something that squeaks at midnight. Then there's the bed frame if you had one. A rich person's bed could be a work of art. Heavy oak or walnut, with carved posts and a canopy. It might even have curtains to keep out drafts and prying eyes. But for the average person, the bed frame might be just a wooden plank laid across barrels, or nothing. You'd sleep on the ground, on a pallet. Sometimes even with family members all in a row, like human sardines. And let's talk about the security situation. You see, there wasn't such a thing as a safe home knot. Really, doors were flimsy. Locks, if they existed, were easily broken. So many peasants added low-tech traps around the sleeping area. Things like pots balanced on chairs so they'd crash if someone came in, or even wooden boards nailed loosely to creak loudly when stepped on. One wrong move and you'd think the place was haunted, which ironically could also keep thieves away. Nobody wants to rob a ghost house. It wasn't just humans you had to worry about though. In colder seasons, wild animals might try to squeeze inside. Foxes, wolves, or worse. If you lived on the edge of the forest, or near the mountains, every groan of timber and howl of wind could trigger just a little healthy paranoia. You might keep a blade tucked under the bedding. Not because you expected a duel at dawn, but because better safe than sorry was more than a motto. It was a survival strategy. Remember that open fire candle from earlier? If it toppled onto your dry straw bedding, instant inferno. There are documented cases of entire families perishing in their sleep due to a knocked-over lamp or unattended hearth. Because while houses were built from timber, thatch, and dreams, they burned fast. And water buckets? Not always handy. You slept light for a reason. People also had some odd ideas about sleep positions. The side position was common, as it was believed to be healthier for digestion and prayerful contemplation. Sleeping on your back was discouraged, it was said, to invite bad spirits or promote laziness. Sleeping face down, considered downright demonic. You were supposed to sleep humbly, not like some decadent Roman emperor. The bedding itself wasn't always clean. Washing sheets was a laborious process, so linens were shaken out more often than they were scrubbed. Some folks even slept directly in their day clothes. Others used long sleeping tunics or nightshirts, often shared across siblings or generations. If you were very poor, your blanket might be a patched-up animal hide, or just more of your own clothing layered for warmth. Fringe belief, alert. Some people thought evil spirits could enter your body more easily while you slept. To combat this, they might sleep with iron under the bed, recite protective prayers, or draw symbols in ash around the room. Were these bedtime habits or low-key exorcisms? It's a blurry line, and we haven't even gotten to snoring. In a shared sleeping space like a longhouse or peasant cottage, snoring wasn't just annoying. It was a full-blown group event. Children, parents, uncles, neighbors, the occasional guest traveler all stacked together, hacking, groaning, shifting, and scratching. Privacy didn't exist. You'd be lulled to sleep by a symphony of nasal honking and gut gurgling. Who needs white noise? Some towns even had communal hostile beds, where travelers paid a small coin to squeeze in, beside strangers. That's right, you'd sleep sandwiched between two unfamiliar people. Probably both snoring, one maybe coughing, and all of you rolling around on a shared straw sack. Try explaining that to your modern sleep hygiene coach. So, as you lie back into your creaky, pest-infested, possibly haunted bed, try not to think too hard about what just brushed your leg. It might be straw, might be a mouse, might be your cousin's cold foot. Either way, just don't move too much. Don't knock the candle, don't wake the rats. And for heaven's sake, don't roll off the side. It's a long fall to a very cold dirt floor. You don't want to open your eyes, but you do. Something smells, ... Smoky. Is that the hearth? Is it the candle? Or worse, is it the roof? Because tonight, like every night in the Middle Ages, you sleep beneath what might as well be a giant tinderbox, that thatched roof over your head. It's not just rustic decor. It's dry. It's crumbly. It's stuffed with kindling. And it's always one bad ember away from disaster. The medieval thatched roof picture. Thick bundles of straw, reeds, or heather layered and packed tightly together. Sometimes 2 feet deep. It was cheap, locally available, and surprisingly good at repelling rain. But it also had a tragic downside. The moment a stray spark landed, it was game over. Because here's the kicker, chimneys weren't always a thing. Early medieval homes often had open hearths in the center of the room. The smoke just drifted upward and out through a hole in the roof called a louver. Sometimes it made it out. Sometimes it just kind of swirled around and turned your ceiling black. And sometimes it landed exactly where you didn't want it to. That means the air inside your house was already thick with smoke. Your clothes, your bedding, your hair, everything smelled like fire. You're breathing it in as you sleep, which makes coughing and sore throats a normal part of morning routine. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Historians still argue whether it affected medieval folks the way it does us today. But it's entirely possible that many headaches, hallucinations, and sudden deaths had something to do with too much time spent inhaling burning peat or wood in a poorly ventilated room. Of course, you could always upgrade. Chimneys started appearing more widely in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in wealthier homes. But even then, they were far from safe. Chimneys clogged easily. Sparks jumped freely, and the upper floor, if you had one, was still just dried straw and timber. Fire safety wasn't really a medieval strong suit. In fact, fires were such a threat that entire neighborhoods were sometimes reduced to ash overnight. Thatched roofs were a big part of the problem. In London, city officials eventually banned thatch within city limits, but not until the 1200s, and even then, plenty of folks just ignored the rule. After all, it was what they knew. You're probably wondering why didn't they use tiles? Or slate? They did, if they were rich. But for everyone else, thatch was the only option, and while it did insulate fairly well, your attic stayed warmer than the rest of the house. It also played host to its own unique brand of nightmare fuel. Because guess who else liked the roof? Animals. Birds nested in it. Insects burrowed into it, and yes, small mammals, like weasels, squirrels, and even snakes, would sometimes make their homes inside. So if you thought the bed was alive, wait until you heard something scratching above you in the dead of night. Nothing like a sudden thump overhead and a light rain of dried grass falling onto your face to send you into full medieval panic mode. Some superstitious folks believed spirits lived in the rafters, especially in older houses. The creaking sounds of the thatch were thought to be whispers or the stirrings of the restless dead. One traveler even wrote of staying in a farmhouse where something with claws skittered across the beams every night. Could have been a rat. Could have been a very offended ghost. He didn't ask Dot to keep fires from spreading too fast. Some people hung wet cloths or covered the hearth before bed. Others left a jar of water nearby, optimistic, considering that putting out a roof fire with one pot is like fighting a volcano with a teacup. Still better than nothing. And then there's the furniture. The bed itself, if it had a canopus, sometimes hung just inches from the thatch. Cloth curtains were meant to keep in warmth and privacy, but they were also dangerously flammable. One wrong spark, and your cozy sleeping nook becomes a funeral pyre, a fringe solution. Some people actually sprinkled sand or clay over parts of the thatch inside to keep it less dry. Others embedded herbs into the straw, believing that strong-smelling plants would deter both pests and fire. We can't say for sure whether it worked. Historians still debate how effective these homegrown strategies really were, if they just made people feel safer. The smell of burning wasn't always a sign of danger, though. It was just everywhere. The hearth burned all day, cooking food and heating water. Candles lit the room. Oil lamps, if you were lucky enough to afford oil, sat on shelves and tables. You became so used to the scent of soot that you barely noticed it until, of course, it changed. When that sharp, dry, panic-inducing smell of burning straw hit your nose, you knew, and then you ran. In some villages, people even designated a night watch to walk through neighborhoods sniffing for smoke, knocking on doors if things seemed suspicious. Not quite the fire department, but close. Of course, they also served other roles, guarding against thieves, watching for wolves, and sometimes spreading juicy gossip. Multitasking at its medieval finest. And here you are, lying there beneath it all, listening, waiting. That little popping sound from the hearth, is it just the fire settling? Or is it something more sinister? You pull your blanket tighter. There's a shiver in the air. A low creak from the beams above. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the roof sighing. Or maybe you should plan your exit path now, just in case. After all, in the Middle Ages, going to bed was always a gamble. Would you wake to the rooster's crow? Or to the smell of smoke and a collapsing roof? Either way, there's no fire extinguisher. No smoke detector. Just a wooden pail and a prayer. Sleep tight. You roll over again, and the bed groans like it's tired of you too. The fire's down to embers. The room smells faintly of char and sweat. And the sounds outside are fading, but inside this stone fortress, sleep is anything but silent. Welcome to the echoing chill of castle life, where even the walls seem to whisper. And the scurrying of tiny feet in the dark is less charming countryside ambience, and more, oh great, rats again. You'd think a stone castle would offer better sleep, right? Solid walls, sturdy doors, height advantage, and sure, you're less likely to get robbed here, but you're also less likely to sleep peacefully. Because stone, as it turns out, doesn't insulate. It echoes, it drips, and it stays cold, very cold. Especially at night. Your bed is up in a chamber, probably near the hall, or tucked behind a tapestry. If you're lucky, there's a fireplace built into the wall. If not, well, bundle up, because the chill isn't just from open windows, it seeps out of the very stones themselves. You could sleep in layers, and still wake up with your breath fogging in front of you. And about those tapestries, yes. They're beautiful, but their main job isn't just decoration. They're medieval insulation. Nobles hung massive woven panels on walls to block out the cold and cover the damp patches. Because yes, even in castles, the walls wept. Moisture would creep in, especially during winter, leaving everything slightly clammy. The stone might look regal, but it felt like sleeping inside a very fancy cave. And then there's the noise. The sound travels in a castle. The clanking of a late guard's boots 3 floors below might rattle up through the halls. A breeze through a narrow window slit becomes a ghostly moan at 2 a.m., and every time someone opens, a heavy oak door creak it echoes like a warning from the crypt. If you're trying to sleep, good luck. There's no white noise machine, just the sound of medieval life echoing off centuries-old stone. But the worst part, the rats. Yes, even in castles. Especially in castles. Grain storage, leftover food, and warm fireplaces made noble manners just as rat-friendly as any peasant hut. In fact, rats loved castles. They ran in the walls, under the floorboards, across the beams. Sometimes, if your bed had curtains, they'd scurry on top of them at night, and you'd hear tiny thuds as they dropped down. Not the stuff lullabies are made of. Cats were often kept indoors to help, but cats in the Middle Ages were, let's say, independent contractors. They might kill a rat, they might nap, they might knock over your only candle at 3 a.m. and start a minor blaze. You never quite knew, and even in your own room, you were rarely alone. Nobles didn't always sleep solo. Servants, guards, squires, even family members could be nearby. Privacy was a luxury, and so was silence. Someone was always snoring, coughing, or mumbling half-remembered prayers into the darkness. The bed itself might be enormous, a great bed of state, complete with curtains, steps, and elaborately carved posts. But again, that's just for show. The mattress, stuffed with feathers if you're highborn, but even feathers have a shelf life. They flatten, they shift, they clump into uncomfortable corners. You might sleep like royalty, but not well. There's also the matter of nighttime visitors. No, not ghosts, though many believed castles were haunted, but rather people. Guards who needed to report news, messengers arriving in the middle of the night, servants checking the fire. Some households were so busy that the night felt more like a hotel lobby than a peaceful retreat. You might be startled awake by a torch, a muttered announcement, or the cold nose of a hunting hound nudging your arm. And just when you think you're finally drifting off, bells. If the castle had a chapel, and most did then, hourly or half-hourly bell tolls weren't uncommon. Some were spiritual reminders. Others were timekeepers for the night watch, or prayer calls for those still awake. Either way, dung, right when you were almost finally asleep. Historians still debate whether nobles actually got more rest than peasants. On one hand, they had softer bedding, warmer clothes, and servants to tend to the fire. On the other hand, they were more likely to be disturbed, lived in louder environments, and let's not forget, were often the target of assassination attempts. Yes, your noble title might come with land and power, but it also meant you slept lightly, because rivals, jealous cousins, and the occasional poisoned goblet were always a threat. One quirky trick nobles used for warmth was the bed warmer, a metal pan filled with embers, slid between the sheets before bed to heat things up. Sounds nice, right? Until someone forgot to remove it before falling asleep and scorched a hole right through the mattress, or worse, themselves. And even those who were more cautious couldn't fully escape the hazards of sleeping at elevation. Those towering castle chambers, they weren't immune to structural issues. A heavy rain might cause leaks through the roof. Windstorms rattled the shutters and made walls tremble. In some cruder constructions, masonry wasn't always stable. It's one thing to fall out of bed. It's another thing to have the ceiling fall on your bed. Eventually, as the night stretches on, you accept the sounds, the cold, the scurrying, the looming possibility of being woken by bells or screams. You nestle deeper under the covers, trying to block out the echoes with a fold of fabric over your ears. But still something shifts again, a new sound. Maybe just the wind. Maybe a rat. Maybe footsteps 3 floors down, growing louder. You stare into the darkness and remind yourself, this is normal. This is life in a castle. This is what sleep means when you live behind stone walls, safe from the outside world, but never truly at peace inside. You try not to panic, but you've just had a dream about your teeth falling out and being chased by shadowy monks. The candle's gone out, the fire's embers are low, and something feels off. You lie still, breath held. Because here in the Middle Ages, nightmares weren't just bad dreams, they were full-on spiritual emergencies. And if you jolted awake from one, that wasn't just indigestion, that might have been the devil. Sleep wasn't a neutral thing in medieval life. It was a time of profound vulnerability, when your soul was thought to float free, wandering the liminal space between life and death. So when people dreamt vivid, terrifying, often hallucinatory dreams, they took them seriously. Not as brain static, but as messages, warnings, or worse evidence of unclean forces hovering too close. Let's say you're a poor farmer. You've eaten a heavy meal of rye bread and cabbage. Your belly's rumbling a little too much, and your mind drifts into uneasy sleep. Suddenly, you see a dark figure standing at the foot of your bed. It whispers in Latin words you don't know, but somehow understand. You wake up drenched in sweat, and now you're convinced you've been visited by something evil. And honestly, you might be right. Because medieval folks didn't separate the physical from the spiritual. That pressure on your chest during sleep. Today we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was called an incubus or a succubus, depending on the mood. A demon pressing down on you while you lay helpless. Sometimes stealing your breath. Sometimes your soul. There's a famous medieval illustration of a woman sleeping while a squat little demon sits smugly on her chest. She's helpless, eyes wide, frozen. This wasn't fantasy. This was medical theory. Physicians of the time believed that bad humors, sinful thoughts, and impure habits could attract such spirits during sleep. So yes, a heavy dinner and a guilty conscience could bring on a literal hellspawn. And that's why people had rituals. Protective prayers. Night charms. Crosses made from wax or wood hung near the bed. Shoes turned upside down to confuse malevolent forces. Some even avoided sleeping facing west because that was where the sun died. Symbolically and spiritually. West-facing sleep meant inviting in darkness. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were truly widespread. Across every class, or mostly rooted in ecclesiastical literature. But either way, enough folk remedies and bedtime prayers survived to show that fear of sleep-related visitations was very real. And of course, there was the church. Monks wrote extensively about dreams, both divine and diabolical. If you dreamt of fire, blood, or serpents, it might be a sign you were harboring hidden sin. Dream of angels or glowing light. That could be divine favor. Or dangerous pride. The line was never clear. In fact, many religious orders discouraged people from placing too much faith in dreams. They might be tests, or traps. But the fear didn't stop people from trying to interpret them. Dream books were surprisingly popular. Manuscripts circulated, listing symbols and their meanings. Dream of water, change is coming. Dream of falling, a warning. Dream of teeth, still terrifying, even back then. Some of these guides mixed biblical themes with older pagan beliefs, creating a strange blend of mysticism, superstition, and half-remembered Greek philosophy. And then there were sleep demons with names, like Maras in Nightmare. This old Germanic spirit was believed to sit on people's chests, suffocating them in their sleep. People placed knives under their pillows, drew protective circles, or whispered spells to keep it away. Yes, your bed was technically your refuge, but it was also a battleground. You didn't just tuck in, you armed up. One fringe belief said that if you slept with your mouth open, a spirit could sneak in and take your soul. So people learned to sleep with lips tightly sealed, or covered their faces with cloth, of course. This also had the nice bonus of keeping out bugs, which were, let's face it, far more likely to crawl into your mouth than a ghost. And speaking of protection, let's not forget saints. People called on Saint Michael for protection during dreams, or hung images of saints by the bed to ward off evil. Some even kept relics, bits of bone, cloth, or even teeth beneath their pillows, believing these holy objects could keep their dreams pure, and if they failed, well, good luck surviving the night. In noble houses, dreams were discussed over breakfast. Sometimes they were written down. Advisors might be asked to interpret them, especially if a nobleman dreamt of war, betrayal, or famine. One royal's bad night could spark weeks of political anxiety. Sleep wasn't private. It was public data. Even ordinary people took dreams seriously enough to change their behavior. If you dreamt of drowning, maybe you skipped a planned fishing trip. If you saw a black dog in your sleep, you might avoid strangers for a week. Superstition wove through every decision, and the boundary between dream and prophecy was always soft, always shifting. And let's not forget the architecture of dreams. Medieval people believed you could dream your way into other worlds, sometimes heavenly, sometimes infernal. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a famous mystic, described entire visionary landscapes seen in sleep. Dreaming wasn't just personal, it was divine theater, but for you. Lying in this bed in your lumpy shirt, listening to the occasional scurry of feet above the rafters, dreams feel more like threats than gifts. You're afraid to close your eyes again, afraid you'll fall back into that dark space where the line between your body and the world bends. So you whisper the same charm your grandmother taught you. You draw a tiny cross on your chest. You adjust your sleep rag, and you try once again to trick yourself into peace. Maybe this time, your soul will stay put. Maybe this time, nothing will sit on your chest. Maybe this time, you'll make it to morning. You don't know what woke you, but something did. Maybe a floorboard creaked. Maybe the wind whispered your name a little too clearly. Or maybe it's just the deep, gnawing instinct that someone's supposed to be awake right now, and that someone might have been you. Because here in the Middle Ages, nights were rarely left unattended. Someone always had to keep watch. And if they didn't, bad things happened. You crack open your eyes and glance toward the door, where a door should be. In many medieval homes, there wasn't one. Just a curtain, or a wooden slab balanced on crude hinges. And behind it, the wide black night stretches like a threat. You're not alone in your house. Not really. There's your family, your animals, maybe even a guest curled under a threadbare cloak near the hearth. But none of them are moving, which means it's your turn in peasant households. Night watch wasn't a formality. It was a rotating duty, a shared expectation. Someone had to stay half awake, eyes open, ears tuned, fire fed. It wasn't about being heroic. It was about survival. Bandits could come. Wolves, stray embers from the hearth, could leap onto the floor. Or worse, someone could stumble out into the dark and never return. There weren't alarms, numbered locks you could trust. So you watched. Sometimes, the watcher didn't even stay seated. They'd walk the single-room house in slow, quiet circles, pacing, listening, tending the fire, and occasionally peeking through cracks in the shutters. They might sip something warm, gruel, ale, or sour milk, to stay alert. If they were lucky, they had a dog. If they were unlucky, the dog barked at shadows that may or may not have been real. You shift in your bedding and hear someone snoring nearby. Your brother, cousin, you can't tell. There's a weight in the room, as if the night has pressed itself against the walls, just waiting to be let in. In wealthier homes, guards or servants handled the night watch, but even then, trust wasn't absolute. You might post more than one watcher inside and out. Because while most people think of medieval villages as sleepy and safe, the reality was messier. Raids happened, neighbors argued, drunken fools stumbled into the wrong home and made themselves very unwelcome, and occasionally, something worse. Historians still argue whether medieval crime rates were as high as some records suggest, or if later chroniclers exaggerated the danger. But legal documents from across Europe mention plenty of nighttime disturbances, break-ins, arson, missing livestock, even entire families vanishing under suspicious circumstances. It's no wonder people treated the darkness like an enemy. And then there were the night walkers. These weren't supernatural creatures, though the line was blurry, but actual humans. People accused of moving through towns after curfew without good reason. Some were just trying to find their way home. Others were suspected of theft, witchcraft, or other moonlit mischief. Many towns established ordinances forbidding movement after sundown, unless you carried a lantern or had a written pass. So if you saw someone moving in the distance, you didn't call out. You watched, you remembered. And in the morning, you might describe what you saw to the reeve, the bailiff, or the local priest. If it came to nothing, fine. But if someone turned up dead, you'd want to have answers. There's a fringe theory that night watchers also acted as informal therapists. People would sometimes whisper secrets to the person on duty, quiet confessions. Fear's sins not quite large enough for a priest. After all, there's something about the dark that loosens the tongue. And speaking of fear, many believed that evil was strongest at night, not just ghosts and goblins, but real-world threats. The devil worked overtime in the early hours. Temptation, anger, even disease were thought to move more freely once the sun had set. That's why monks woke to pray at midnight, not just out of discipline, but to battle the darkness spiritually. If you were in a monastery, the night was carefully divided. Vigils, matins, lauds prayers, scheduled through the darkness like checkpoints against sin. One monk might light the torches, while another droned chants from the psalter. The rest would shuffle in, sleepy but obedient eyes squinting against the cold. And when they returned to their pallets, it wasn't always in peace. Sometimes dreams followed, or strange knocks on the door, or the echo of the last bell still ringing through the halls. You blink again, adjusting to the darkness. You hear the fire pop. A low breath. Something rustles. Is it your turn, or did you already do your shift and forget? The night plays tricks, and without a clock, without any clock, you have only the weight of your eyelids and the sound of the coals to guide you. Some families burned an oiled rope called a night candle, where each knot represented an hour. Others counted prayers to Hail Marys for every hour, whispered slowly, letting the rhythm mark the time. You might even have a water clock, if you're fancy, but mostly, you just guessed. And if you nodded off, well, hopefully nothing bad happened. But there were stories. The village where a man left the fire untended and woke to find the roof gone. The family who slept too hard and woke to find their pigs stolen. The woman who vanished between first and second sleep, never seen again. Her shoes were found by the door. The laces were untied. You sit up. The air is colder now. The fire's nearly out. Someone nearby mutters in sleep, twitching at the edge of a dream. You pull your cloak tighter and rise slowly, stepping over sleeping forms. Careful not to knock over the pot by the hearth. You're not just watching the night, you're holding it back. One slow breath at a time. Because here in the Middle Ages, sleep is a team sport. And if nobody stays awake, nobody wakes up. You shuffle back toward your bedding, legs stiff from standing guard. The fire's a whisper, now barely enough to light the space between you and the rough stone wall. You settle back under the covers, pulling your coarse blanket up to your chin. But just as your eyes start to drift closed again, the baby cries. Of course, because in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just dangerous, sleep was frequently, frustratingly interrupted. Infants, toddlers, and restless children shared beds, or slept within arm's reach. And if you've ever tried to sleep next to a teething, coughing, or nightmare-prone child, you know exactly how restful that was. Not at all. Let's set the scene. A single-room cottage, probably housing 2 or 3 generations. 1 or 2 beds. A pallet or 2 on the floor. Maybe a cradle near the hearth, if the family has one. Everyone's asleep or pretending to be when the baby starts to wail. And unlike today, there's no nursery to shuffle off to. The crying echoes through the whole space, bouncing off rafters and straw walls. If the fire hasn't already woken everyone, the baby sure will. Diapers. Well, they existed in a fashion. Cloth, wrapped and pinned. then rinsed in cold water when soiled. But at night, many parents skipped the wrapping entirely. They'd simply swaddle the baby in wool and deal with the aftermath in the morning, which meant surprises. Damp, stinky surprises. Right in bed. And if you were sleeping next to the baby, congratulations, you've now participated in the medieval version of Russian roulette. Feeding the child wasn't much easier. For nursing mothers, nighttime breastfeeding was frequent and expected. But remember, diets were poor. Women were often malnourished, especially after childbirth. Producing enough milk wasn't guaranteed. And if the mother was too weak, a wet nurse might step in, but not at night. Night was yours to manage, and if you didn't have a wet nurse or enough milk, some families used soaked bread or cloth dipped in broth to quiet infants, a kind of makeshift pacifier/food source. Not ideal, not sanitary, but desperation doesn't care about health codes. Children in general were a constant nocturnal wildcard. Some rolled out of bed, others cried from bad dreams. One might sleepwalk straight into the hearth. There were stories of children climbing into animal pens or toddling out the front door during second sleep. So most families developed their own bedtime safety hacks. Ropes to block doorways, wooden bars across the cradle, even tying a child's ankle with a soft cloth to the bedpost, not to restrain, just to detect movement. You might think older children were less disruptive. Not really. They snored, they thrashed, they talked in their sleep. And since privacy wasn't a thing, their parents' nighttime activities, those ones were impossible to hide, which made for awkward family dynamics in the morning. And no, this wasn't limited to peasants. Even noble children sometimes slept in their parents' chambers, either for warmth, safety, or because their own rooms were drafty, haunted, or both. And yet families adapted. Mothers developed a sixth sense waking, just moments before a baby stirred. Fathers could tell the difference between a hungry cry and a dreaming whimper. Sleep was choppy, yes, but it was communal. You were never truly alone, never truly rested. Either, historians still debate whether this constant closeness created stronger familial bonds or just long-term sleep deprivation. It probably did both. But one thing's certain, the modern concept of a quiet night didn't exist. If it wasn't the baby, it was the fire. If it wasn't the fire, it was the wind, or the rats, or your neighbor yelling about their stolen pig again. Good times. In some villages, midwives offered postnatal advice about sleep-suggesting swaddling styles, lullabies, and nighttime feeding strategies. Many of these were based on folk wisdom. Some believed rocking the cradle counterclockwise could ward off evil spirits. Others swore by herbs like chamomile or poppy for soothing fussy infants. The more fringe beliefs leaned toward tying protective charms to a baby's ankle or sewing blessings into their blankets. And yes, lullabies were a thing. Quiet songs, often hauntingly beautiful, whispered to infants under their breath. These weren't always cheerful. Many were full of warnings. Stay quiet, or the wolf will come. Close your eyes, or the spirits will find you. Not exactly the modern twinkle twinkle, but they worked. Sort of. Even the act of swaddling had meaning. Babies were wrapped tightly to keep them warm, to prevent them from flailing. And believe it or not, to shape their limbs correctly. It was thought that loose limbs would grow crooked or weak. So a baby might be bundled like a tiny medieval burrito and placed beside the mother for the entire night. Some nights, if the baby was calm and the siblings stayed quiet, a parent might even catch a few uninterrupted hours. But most of the time, sleep came in chunks. You dozed when you could. You snapped awake without warning, and you always kept an ear out because a single cough, cry, or soft mew from the cat could mean it was your turn again. Eventually, the baby settles. The cradle creaks softly. Someone sighs. The darkness presses back into place. You roll to your other side, listening to the sound of tiny breathing nearby. And for a brief flickering moment, the room feels peaceful again. Even with the bed crowded, even with your leg half off the edge, even with the cold creeping back in, you breathe. In, out. Maybe, just maybe, this stretch of sleep will last longer than the others. Or maybe not. You're finally asleep again, sort of. But now your dreams feel odd. Not frightening, not peaceful either. Just a little too vivid, a little too real. And as you drift deeper, something strange begins to happen. Not in your dream, but in the real, waking world. Because the medieval body didn't just sleep through the night, like modern folks do. No, it divided the night in half. Welcome to the curious world of segmented sleep. You stir again sometime after midnight, not fully awake, but definitely no longer dreaming. It's not insomnia. It's just normal. Because in the Middle Ages, people typically slept in two distinct phases: first sleep and second sleep. The term appears in diaries, letters, medical texts, and even court records. First sleep would begin shortly after dusk and last a few hours. Then came an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, followed by second sleep, which lasted until dawn. You rub your eyes, not even surprised to find yourself awake. This is just how it works. First sleep ends around midnight. You lie still, letting your thoughts wander. Maybe you pray. Maybe you whisper to the person beside you. Maybe you get up, stir the fire, or slip outside to relieve yourself, though. Good luck doing that without freezing your backside off. This waking period had a name: the watch. For some, it was a time of reflection. For others, a brief moment of productivity. You might mend a shirt, stir the soup pot, check on the animals, read scripture. If you were literator, listen to someone else do so aloud. In fact, many believed that this was the ideal time for spiritual clarity. Monks and nuns scheduled midnight prayers precisely because this liminal state between sleep and wakefulness was thought to be sacred. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was universal, or just common in certain regions and classes, but the written evidence suggests it was widespread enough to shape daily rhythms. Some physicians even prescribed it. In the 16th century, one medical text advised patients to rise after first sleep, read a little, reflect, then return to bed. This was considered healthy, and it makes sense. Without artificial light, your sleep synced with the sun and the hearth. The moment dusk fell, you'd begin winding down. Candlelight, if you had it, was precious and expensive, so most people simply accepted darkness as bedtime. But instead of sleeping 8 hours straight, an invention of the industrial age, thank you very much, you slept in 2 waves. During the watch, families might talk softly, couples might whisper secrets, and yes, intimacy often happened then too. Midwives even advised it as the best time to conceive. Something about the body being more relaxed, the mind more open. Theories varied, but clearly, this interval wasn't wasted. Still, not all uses of the watch were so wholesome. In towns and cities, crime rates often rose during this period. Thieves knew people would be drowsy and distracted. Some scholars believe this lull in communal awareness made nighttime break-ins easier. And if you were up wandering the streets during the watch, you'd better have a good excuse, lest you be mistaken for a night walker, or worse, accused of witchcraft or creeping sin. Speaking of sin, let's talk about guilt. The medieval mind was acutely aware of moral failure, and the silent hours between first and second sleep were ripe for reflection and, often, regret. It's no accident that bedtime prayers were long, specific, and thorough. Forgive me for stealing eggs. Forgive me for speaking harshly to my brother. Forgive me for eyeing the merchant's wife too long. Darkness had a way of loosening tongues both in confession and in desire. Of course, not everyone used the watch to dwell. Some used it practically. A farmer might go out to check the livestock. A baker could start preparing dough for the morning. A mother might rock a restless child, or rub warmth into a sleeping one's hands. Tasks were quiet, slow, purposeful. You wouldn't run around making noise. That would be unsettling. It would break the sacred stillness. In some households, the watch was used to tell stories. Oral tradition was everything. With no books, no phones, no screens, what else would you do? A grandfather might murmur a tale of a saint or a soldier. A sister might recount a local ghost story. And everyone, from toddlers to elders, would listen. Not with wide eyes, but with soft, flickering attention, half in the room, half still in dreams. And sometimes, yes, you just lay there. You stared at the ceiling. You thought about the weather, the harvest, the odd sound the pig made yesterday, the debt you owe your neighbor, the rumor about the priest and the brewer's daughter, your life, your death, the faint crackle of the fire, the mystery of what tomorrow might bring. Some nights, you might even use this interval to sneak out. Not for mischief, though, that certainly happened, but to take in the stars, or sit in the cold stillness, alone for a moment. Just to feel like your own person. Even in a world where privacy didn't exist. You roll over again, heart a little, steadier now. Your eyes are heavy. Your limbs melt into the scratchy linen. Second sleep is calling. It won't be long now. The house is quiet. Even the baby has stilled. You let out a breath, long and slow. Because that's how it works here. The first sleep takes your body. The watch stirs your mind. And second sleep carries your soul the rest of the way to dawn. You're deep in second sleep now, the room hushed, your limbs heavy and unmoving. But suddenly there's a sound. Not a loud one, not yet, just movement. Outside, you hear a distant bleating, a clatter, something brushing past the wall. And then clang a gate, maybe even a scream. You're up in a flash, heart pounding in your chest. Because tonight's nightmare has stepped out of your dreams and into the dark. The village might be under attack. Raids, believe it or not, weren't just the stuff of epic poetry. They were terrifyingly real, especially in border regions, coastal towns, or disputed territories. Even well inland, you weren't safe. Whether it was bandits, mercenaries, rival lords, or full-blown foreign invaders, medieval people lived with the constant threat that one night, someone would command everything you owned, including your life, would be taken, so you weren't paranoid. You were prepared. That's why some people didn't sleep through the night at all. Guards were posted, gates were barred, dogs were trained to alert, and every house had something: a club, a blade, a sharpened stick hidden somewhere near the bed, not for decoration, for survival. You press yourself to the wall, straining your ears. The wind's picked up. The fire's nearly dead. Someone else is stirring now. A muffled curse. A door creaks. If this is a raid, you've only got minutes, maybe seconds, to act, and that's assuming they haven't already breached the outer fence. These weren't always grand Viking assaults, or siege engines rolling across fields. Sometimes it was simpler and more personal. A nearby village, angry over grazing rights. A jealous noble sending a few thugs to collect a debt. A group of starving men turned desperate and violent. Small scale, brutal, and sudden. And the worst part, it always happened at night. Because darkness hides faces, hides movement, hides shame. No one wants to be seen stealing grain or dragging a family from their home. And if you do it in the night, there's a better chance no one will ever know who did it, or why. Historians still debate how often villages were attacked during peacetime, but the fear was constant, enough so that entire communities would create systems of defense, day and night. Some even had organized night watch rotations, horn signals, or fire beacons placed on nearby hills. If one village saw torches approaching, they'd light their own, warning others in the valley. It was primitive, but it worked. Sometimes, there's a fringe belief that certain animals were used as early warning systems: geese, for example, loud, obnoxious, and loyal. Roman legions had once praised them as the ultimate alarm birds. And it turns out, medieval peasants agreed. Chickens, useless, but geese, oh, they'll honk at anything. Including a midnight raider with a torch in his hand and murder in his eyes. You hear a voice outside, now quick, harsh. Someone shouts a name, not yours, but one you recognize. Then another, clang, a scuffle, and then quiet. Maybe it wasn't a raid. Maybe it was a drunk neighbor coming home late. Or a fight between young men that ended as quickly as it began. That's the thing about medieval nights. They blurred the line between reality and nightmare, between genuine danger and imagined chaos. And just like that, the village seems to exhale again. A cough, a low whisper, a dog barking once, then going quiet. Someone tosses another log on their hearth. The moment passes but your pulse doesn't. You're awake now, and there's no going back to sleep just yet. So you lie there, eyes open, waiting for the world to settle. Back then, your house was your fortress, but only barely. Walls made of wattle and daub, thatched roof above, livestock penned up outside. If someone really wanted in, they'd get in. So many households simply placed faith in numbers, safety in sleeping together, alertness in rotation, and the hope that any attacker would go for an easier target first. In castles and larger manors, the threat was different, less random, more political. A disgruntled vassal, a power-hungry neighbor, an opportunistic rival. One historical account tells of a nobleman ambushed in his sleep by his own brother, who crept into his chambers through a hidden servant's passage. The only reason the man survived: his hound bit the intruder before he could draw his blade. Yes, dogs were more than pets. They were protectors. Some families even trained them to sleep lightly near the doorway, ears twitching for trouble. And if you didn't have a dog, you had a stick, or your fists, or a prayer. And then there were the fires. Not the good kind, not hearths and candles. No, we're talking about torches. Molotovs, medieval style. A favorite raiding tactic. Set the barn ablaze. Watch the villagers panic. Then, attack when they're distracted. People slept lightly because they had to. Sleep too deeply, and you might wake to smoke in your lungs and no home left to defend. You sit up slowly. You're not going back to sleep yet. Not with that pounding heart. You pull your cloak tighter, feet curled beneath you. You wait. Listen. Breathe. Eventually, the night begins to soften again. The breeze quiets. The threat fades, because that's how it always goes. Fear swells, crashes, then withdraws, and you lie there. In the aftermath, eyes half closed, wondering how many more nights you'll spend waiting for the worst that never quite comes but might. The horizon is still black, but something about the silence has changed. It's no longer the tense stillness of fear, but the heavy, sleepy quiet that hints at dawn. You lie there, blankets half kicked off, ears still tuned to every creak of the rafters, and you realize, somehow, you're still tired. You've slept twice, you've stood watch, you've listened to possible raiders, and yet, you're exhausted. Welcome to medieval sleep deprivation. You are not alone, because for all its slow pace and rustic charm, medieval life was relentlessly tiring. And sleep, as you've probably noticed by now, was not exactly a restorative experience. Interrupted, communal, drafty, dangerous. And now, as the first rooster dares to crow somewhere down the lane, you realize morning duties are already calling. And yes, even if you haven't slept well. For peasants, the day started early. The moment the sky turned from ink black to charcoal gray, the village began to stir. Not from choice, but from necessity. Animals needed tending. Fires needed relighting. Water needed fetching, sometimes from wells a quarter-mile away. If you were lucky, you had time to rub the sleep from your eyes. If you weren't, you rolled straight from your lumpy pallet into your work boots. And let's not forget breakfast. Or more accurately, the lack thereof. A crust of bread, a bit of porridge, maybe ale or milk, if the cow hadn't gone dry or been stolen last night. Sleep-deprived and slightly shivering, you'd chew quietly in the cold, trying to brace yourself for another long, grinding day. It's no wonder some folks skipped sleep entirely during busy seasons. During harvest time or sheep shearing weeks, people stayed up most of the night working under the moonlight, grabbing tiny naps between tasks. And religious festivals, they often included overnight processions, vigils, and, if we're honest, revelry that didn't exactly pair well with restful slumber. Nobles fared better, but only just. They had softer beds and warmer clothes, yes, but also relentless responsibilities. Letters to read, meetings to attend, land disputes to settle, and servants constantly coming in and out. Sleeping in didn't really exist, not unless you were sick or scandalously lazy. Even monasteries had brutal schedules. Picture this: you're a monk. You've gone to bed after Compline prayers. Maybe around 8 or 9 p.m., you've just gotten into that sweet first sleep when the bell tolls. Time for Vigils. You shuffle into the cold stone chapel in silence, chanting by torchlight until your throat is raw. Then stumble back to your bed for a few hours before waking again for lauds at sunrise. The spiritual benefits, immeasurable, they say. The sleep, quality, not great. Historians still argue about how people functioned with so little solid rest. Some suggest that segmented sleep and long daylight naps balanced things out. Others think people were simply used to exhaustion. After all, when everyone's tired, it becomes the baseline. No one expects you to be chipper, just alive. Preferably standing, and sleep aids. Forget it. No cozy herbal teas, or blackout curtains. Some families burned calming herbs like lavender, but those were luxuries. More commonly, people just drank beer, wine, ale, not to party, but to sleep. Alcohol dulled the edge of discomfort and helped you forget about the hole in the roof or the rats under the bed, until it wore off around 2 a.m., and you woke up sweating and disoriented. There's also the odd theory that people in the Middle Ages dreamed more deeply, not because they were better rested, but because their waking lives were so physically demanding that sleep became the only space for emotional release. Vivid dreams, rich symbolism, spiritual visitations. Maybe the body was too tired to resist whatever the mind wanted to show. And the long-term effects? Well, medieval people did age fast. By the time you were 30, your joints cracked, your teeth ached, your back had seen some things, and sleep debt. It piled up fast. Most people were perpetually overtired, undernourished, and sore. And yet, they kept going, because they had to. One quirky record from a 14th century English manor shows that a particular shepherd fell asleep so often on the job that they replaced him with a boy of 10 years, who proved more alert. A literal child was deemed more functional than a grown man simply because he hadn't accumulated 2 decades of exhaustion. Brutal, but understandable. Even the church acknowledged the problem. Priests sometimes gave penance in the form of fasting from sleep, staying awake in prayer through the night as an act of spiritual devotion, which is a fascinating punishment to assign to someone already surviving on 5 hours, and a miracle you stretch now, limbs creaking, back twinging. Outside, the roosters keep crowing. Someone's chopping wood. A cart rumbles past, creaking over frozen ruts in the dirt path. It's morning, which means sleep time is officially over. Whether you've got enough or not, you rise, quietly, carefully, stepping around the others still tangled in their bedding. Some groan, one rolls over, another just keeps snoring. Maybe they had second watch, or maybe they just gave up trying because, here's the secret. Medieval people didn't expect sleep to be good. They expected it to be enough, barely. Just enough to make it through the day, just enough to carry water, patch holes, thresh wheat, survive childbirth, pray properly, pluck fleas out of your socks, and maybe if you're lucky laugh once or twice at the local fool's attempt to juggle goose eggs in the square. You step outside, the wind slaps your face, the sky is gray, your feet are already sore, but at least you survived the night, again. You're moving now, shoulders tight, eyes squinting against the low morning light filtering through wood smoke and fog. Everyone around you is doing the same stretching, yawning, wiping sleep from their faces like it's something they can scrape off. And here's the thing. Most of them look like they didn't sleep well, because they didn't. No one did. But no one expected to. And nobody talked about it like a problem. In the Middle Ages, being perpetually tired was simply part of the human condition. There was no pressure to get 8 solid hours, because that wasn't even seen as a possibility. Instead, people adapted to poor sleep, developed odd schedules, and built a quiet resilience around fatigue. Exhaustion wasn't something to fix. It was something to manage. You glance toward the fields, where the first workers are already dragging tools behind them. Their gait is familiar. Slow, a little hunched, but determined. Sleep-deprived, yes, but also driven by necessity. If the grain isn't sown today, there's no bread in 3 months. If the sheep don't get checked now, one might go missing, or drop dead of something you won't understand until it's too late. And so the medieval day chugs forward, powered by Jan's routine and the occasional swig of ale. Everyone is tired. Everyone has chores. But everyone also accepts that fatigue is just part of the job. Interestingly, some people even use tiredness as a social cue. In court records, servants often cited being half asleep as an excuse for poor behavior or missed instructions. One stable boy in 1321 explained that he failed to shut a gate because his mind was still in sleep. Rather than being punished, he was told to sleep harder tomorrow. A little sarcasm, sure, but also understanding. This was a world without sleep hygiene. No scheduled wind-down routine, no chamomile, no bedtime playlists with ocean sounds. If anything, your lullabies were the rattling of the shutters, the thump of feet above, or the drunk neighbors snoring in the next room. If you managed to drift off, that was a gift, not a guarantee. In fact, sleep wasn't always desirable. Some believed it was a time of weakness, even moral vulnerability. Idle sleep, they warned, left the soul open to temptation. That's why sloth was considered one of the 7 deadly sins. But excessive rest, some moralists even scolded people for napping too long during the day, calling it a luxury fit for nobles and cows. Historians still argue whether this anti-sleep rhetoric was widely internalized, or if it mostly came from clergy with too much time and parchment. But still, it's telling that people often justified their naps or long sleeps by saying, "I had been ill," or "I prayed until exhaustion." Sleep needed a moral excuse. And then there was the weather. Winter brought long nights, but not necessarily more rest. You'd go to bed early, because it was cold and dark. Yes, but you'd wake often from shivering, sniffling, or the rats trying to chew through your grain sack. And summer. The sun rose early, and so did you. Long daylight hours meant more work, so less sleep. Again, and through it all, the beds themselves didn't help. You probably imagined something simple: straw, mattress, blanket, maybe a wooden frame, but mattress might be generous. For many, bedding meant a sack filled with hay or reeds, spread out on the dirt floor. Blankets were made of rough wool or old cloaks. Feathers, if you were wealthy. Furs, if you were really wealthy. Everyone else layers, piled on top of each other. And if you shifted too much, the straw poked through. And pests. Oh, the pests. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, bedtime companions that no one could quite escape. Some people slept with herb bundles under their blankets to try and ward them off. Others just scratched through the night. You could boil your clothes or comb your hair with vinegar, but nothing worked forever. Sleep, when you got it, was always a bit itchy. One odd tradition involves sprinkling fine ash beneath bedding, believed to absorb sweat, repel insects, and possibly draw out bad spirits. It worked about as well as you'd imagine, but it gave people something to try. And trying was half the game. And let's not forget snoring. In a shared bed or even a shared room, it wasn't just your sleep. You had to worry about it. Everyone else's snorers, sleep talkers, and restless kickers were just part of the background noise. People didn't expect silence. They expected chaos, and adapted. There's a lovely fringe theory that medieval people developed. Unique lullabies, specifically to block out environmental noise. Not to soothe children, but to help adults sleep through livestock, screaming babies, and the communal din of 10 people sleeping in one small room. One example includes a soft chant about oxen sleeping in straw, which isn't about animals at all. It's a metaphor for weary humans trying to rest in rough conditions. Sleep poetry, but with hooves. You look around your home, your fellow sleepers slowly rising, blinking, stretching. One person rubs their neck, another sneezes into the firelight. Everyone looks tired, but no one complains, because this is what mornings look like. Not glamorous, not peaceful, just a little sore, a little dazed, and very much alive. Because here, in the Middle Ages, sleep is not a luxury, it's a gamble. You take what you can get. You rest when the world allows it, and then you carry on. You shuffle outside with the others, still groggy, the air sharp in your lungs. The sky is beginning to blush at the edges, pink smudges creeping above the rooftops. There's mud under your feet, and smoke drifting low from a dozen chimneys, and your stomach growls in a way that tells you yesterday's bread crust didn't do the job. You're tired deep in your bones, but there's no such thing as calling in sick from the medieval grind. Still, there is a strange kind of beauty to these early hours. The village hasn't quite woken yet. Just a few souls trudging to wells, or chasing stray chickens. You can hear the world breathe. Somewhere, someone sings softly a morning chant, maybe, or a work song passed down for generations. And in this quiet, the weight of sleep, or the lack of it, feels a little lighter. But don't get too cozy, because the medieval day doesn't care how much rest you got. There are tasks to do, deadlines to meet, taxes to pay, and 100 tiny dangers waiting to trip you up. And if you fall behind, you don't get fired, you starve. Or worse, you draw the attention of the Lord, the Reeve, or the taxman. All three have the power to ruin your week. Still, you wonder, was sleep always this much of a mess? Turns out, no. In some parts of the medieval world, people had slightly better setups. In warmer regions, for example, folks sometimes slept outdoors. During the summer, on raised platforms to avoid bugs and snakes. That sounds like a nightmare in its own right, but at least it was cool. And some wealthier households, particularly in Italy and southern France, built dedicated sleeping chambers, with thick shutters, cushioned pallets, and even early forms of mosquito netting. That said, these were rare luxuries. For most people, sleep was squeezed in where it could fit. And if the house was too full, you might sleep in the barn, curled between sheep. Cozy, yes, sanitary, not remotely. But sometimes, the warm flank of Way was the difference between shivering all night and actually resting. Historians still argue about how much sleep the average person really got. Based on seasonal rhythms, segmented sleep patterns, and daily workloads, the general guess falls somewhere between 5 and 7 total hours, split across 2 or 3 segments. Some folks caught naps during the day, especially elderly family members or monks. Others didn't dare. Too much to do. Too many eyes watching. And then there were the sleep superstitions. You've probably gathered that the medieval mind didn't see sleep as entirely neutral. It was mysterious, dangerous, and spiritually loaded. People worried about what might happen while they slept and what they might bring back from their dreams. Some believed that evil spirits could enter your mouth or ears if you slept with your head uncovered. So even in summer, folks wrapped themselves up like human burritos. Others tied small charms around their necks or ankles, bits of iron, dried herbs, or hand-stitched blessings meant to ward off nightmares and wandering souls. One of the most widely feared nighttime entities was the nightmare, not just a bad dream, but a literal being, a demon or spirit that sat on your chest and stole your breath. If you woke up in the night, gasping and paralyzed, they said it had visited you. Today, we call that sleep paralysis. Back then, you'd be burning sage in the morning and sleeping with a knife under your pillow the next night. And speaking of dreams, those mattered. Big time. Your dreams were believed to contain messages from God, from the saints, or sometimes from the devil. A dream of falling might mean temptation. A dream of teeth might mean death. A dream of flying, either spiritual elevation or a sign of witchcraft. Depends on who you asked, and whether they liked you. Dream interpreters, usually clergy or village elders, took these reports seriously. Some towns even kept a record of major dreams during times of crisis. One odd example from a German town mentions 5 different people dreaming about drowning pigs before a devastating flood hit. Coincidence? Historians debate it. But for the people who lived it, dreams were warnings, and nightmares weren't just spiritual, they were physical. If you ate too much before bed, especially heavy or rich foods, you were said to invite bad humors. A bloated stomach meant bloated thoughts. Some even believed cheese caused nightmares. Honestly, still plausible. As a result, light meals and herbal tonics were sometimes recommended in the evening. If you could afford them, you meanwhile are remembering the cabbage soup you had last night, and wondering if that's why your dream involved drowning in a well full of eels. All of this, the broken sleep, the shared beds, the nightmares, the baby crying, the wind in the rafters creates a strange relationship to rest. Sleep was necessary, but it wasn't trusted. You did it because you had to. But you never turned your back on the dark completely. And yet, through all of that, people did sleep. Not well, not consistently, but enough. Enough to plow the fields, enough to sing lullabies, enough to light the candles at matins, enough to walk across a frostbitten yard and whisper a story to a child, still shivering in bed, because sleep wasn't about being refreshed. It was about being ready for whatever came next. The day wears on, your limbs dragging like sacks of grain, but your mind can't help drifting back to the night, the way the cold pressed against your spine, how the baby whimpered, the eerie stillness after that shouting near the gates. Sleep is never far from your thoughts in the Middle Ages, not because it's restorative, but because it's elusive. A luxury cloaked as routine, a daily surrender that never quite gives you what it promises. As afternoon shadows stretch, some people begin thinking of rest again, not sleep. Exactly, just moments of stillness. A short sit by the hearth, a lean against the barn wall. But there's work to finish first, always. And if you're lucky, tonight might be a quieter one. No screaming goats, no surprise visitors, no fires. But you'd never bet on that. The truth is, despite all this broken, uncertain, communal, and sometimes terrifying rest, medieval people had surprisingly enduring sleep customs, ones that echoed through generations, deeply shaping the rituals of night. Take bedtime blessings, for instance. You might murmur a prayer before sleep, not a formal chant, just a whispered plea. Keep the hearth from going out. Keep the rats in the walls. Keep death from coming in through the keyhole. Children were taught these lines as early as they were, taught how to sweep ash or carry water. Sleep was sacred, so was surviving it, and bedding itself had meaning too. When a couple married, one of their few shared possessions might be a marriage bed, literally handed down through generations. These weren't ornate canopies with silk drapes, but rough-framed platforms that creaked with every turn. They soaked up years of stories, births, illnesses, fights, laughter. When a grandparent passed away, that bed might be reused, just dusted off and restuffed. A bed was a cradle and a coffin, a place of renewal and eventual rest. Literal rest. In towns there were also professional bed testers. Yep. Certain inns or households, if they had a reputation to maintain, employed people, usually young boys or elderly women, to climb onto the bedding before a guest arrived and confirm that it was sound, warm, and flea-light. Not flea-free, just less flea-ridden. And you thought your hotel check-ins were bad. Historians still debate how regional these traditions were, whether the French obsession with feather bedding or the English fondness for warming stones really marked cultural differences, or if they were just the quirks of scattered records. But one thing is agreed upon: the rituals of sleep were deeply embedded in medieval life, even if the sleep itself was anything but serene. One curious fringe practice: the bedside confession. Some believed that your final thoughts before sleeping helped shape your soul, not just in prayer, but in memory. You were encouraged to think through the day, list your sins, and forgive others silently before closing your eyes. It wasn't about religious piety. Alone, it was a kind of mental cleansing, a reset, because you didn't know if you'd wake up, especially in winter, especially during plague years, especially if your bed was in the coldest part of the room, next to the wall with the draft that never really went away. And yet, people still craved sleep. They still sought softness, a folded cloak beneath the head, a warm body beside you, a sheepdog curled by your toes, the glow of the coals still pulsing under the ash. These tiny comforts formed a fragile shield against the sharp teeth of the dark. You begin to prepare now. It's late afternoon, and already the sun is slipping. You gather kindling, mend a torn sleeve, and begin thinking about the fire will it hold tonight. You double-check the latch on the door. You poke your head into the loft to make sure the kids aren't sleeping on a broken beam again. You nudge a chicken off the stool you'll be sitting on soon. And then, finally, the twilight settles. Dinner is eaten. Beds are fluffed, such as they are. Blankets folded, prayers murmured. And you prepare, once again, to gamble with the dark, because no matter how unpredictable, uncomfortable, or unsafe it might be, you have to sleep. Because if you don't, the body begins to crack. Muscles tremble. Memory blurs. Mistakes pile up. And in a world where survival hinges on rhythm planting, harvesting, hauling, mending, bartering, you cannot afford to be useless. Not even for a day. That's why even warriors, those hulking figures from songs and legends, were taught how to rest strategically. A night before battle might be ordered to sleep, the afternoon before a dawn raid, not out of comfort, but to ensure reaction time, focus, clarity. The body needed rest like it needed armor, and when armor failed, sleep was the only shield you had left. And so, as the stars blink back into the night sky, and the last spoon clinks against a wooden bowl, you return to your corner. You lie down, and you brace yourself. Not for sleep itself, but for what sleep might bring: the creaks, the cries, the creeping cold, and maybe, if you're lucky, one dream worth remembering. The fire's gone low again. Not out, just whispering coals beneath a layer of ash. The kind of glow that doesn't really warm the room, but keeps the dark from getting too smug. You're lying down now, your back sore from a day's work and a night of broken rest. Everyone around you is settling into their nests of cloth and hay, some with cloaks still wrapped tightly, others already snoring. A few whispering last words into the heavy air. You're ready, but not for deep sleep. No one really expects that here. You're ready for another round of whatever passes for rest in the Middle Ages. Tonight, maybe there will be no screaming, no shouting, no pigs running loose, or bells tolling in the far-off abbey. Maybe the wind won't rattle the shutters loose. Maybe the rats will stay in the walls where they belong. It's almost peaceful, and your neighbor shifts with a groan, muttering something about sore knees. Another coughs so hard you half sit up, thinking he's choking, before he rolls over and pulls the blanket higher. This is just how it goes. Sleep doesn't arrive like a luxury sedan. It limps in, dragging its feet, brushing against the edge of your consciousness like a moth tapping at candlelight. And if it stays, count yourself lucky. Even the church had something to say about nights like this. Monks wrote of drowsy devotions, of prayers mumbled through yawns and nodding heads. They weren't ashamed, just honest. One friar described falling asleep mid-chant and waking up to realize he'd somehow switched to a psalm about goats. We've all been there, buddy. But that was the reality. Faith didn't erase fatigue. It just folded it into the ritual. And outside the cloister, it was no better. Farmers collapsed where they stood, especially after long harvest days. Midwives nodded off between births, jerking awake when the laboring woman called for water. Even nobles took afternoon rests, disguised as strategy meetings, just to sneak a few moments of stillness. Sleep was always catching, you mid-task, mid-thought, mid-prayer. Historians still argue whether medieval people resented sleep or simply tolerated it. There's no definitive answer. What's clear is that they never romanticized it. No one expected dreamy peace or soft music. No one promised it would leave you refreshed. Sleep was just a reset button, an imperfect, inconsistent, always slightly disappointing one. And yet, it was deeply human. There's something oddly intimate about knowing that even in this rough world, people still curled up at night, side by side, breathing in rhythm. Children clung to their parents. Grandparents whispered old songs. Lovers tucked frozen toes against each other's shins. Communities didn't just wake together, they slept together. Not out of choice, but because walls were thin, beds were shared, and the dark didn't care who you were. And in that togetherness, a strange kind of comfort. The wolves might howl, the wind might wail, the candle might gutter out, but someone, somewhere in the same room, was also awake, also afraid, also listening to the same creaks and whispers. You were never alone, not even in your most vulnerable hours, not even when sleep failed you, and eventually, it will come. It always does. You feel it, now your limbs heavier, your breath longer, your thoughts fuzzier around the edges. You hear someone mutter your name in their sleep, then go silent again. The fire lets out a small pop. Outside an owl hoots once, and vanishes into the trees. And as you drift slower this time, more willingly you know that the night won't be perfect. You'll wake up again, maybe twice, maybe more, but that's okay. That's just sleep in the Middle Ages. a fragile gift, a nightly truce between body and world. And now, we fade gently into the wind down. So here you are again, lying in the quiet after a long and curious journey through a medieval night. The fire is down to its final embers now, barely enough to light the edge of the room, casting soft, golden shadows that flicker and breathe like gentle sighs. The air feels cooler against your cheeks. The voices have faded. Even the creaking rafters seem to have eased their complaints. You made it. Through the cold. Through the watch. Through the whispers and restless stirrings. And even if the sleep wasn't perfect, it was something. A little space. A little stillness. A little rest in a world that rarely paused. Your body sinks now, deeper into the bedding, and if it's rough, even if it crinkles beneath you. You stretch one last time, the way someone might before diving underwater. Not in haste, just with quiet acceptance. The night is almost over. Morning will come, as it always does, but not yet, not now. Let your breath slow. Let your jaw unclench. Let the strange echoes of history soften in your mind. There's nothing left to do. Nothing left to prove. Just this moment. Just this hush. Just this comfort in knowing that, even 1,000 years ago, someone lay just like you, tired, thoughtful, maybe a little sore, and let themselves drift. You're safe now. You can let go. Sleep, if it wants to, will find you again, and you'll be ready.